Good afternoon. Thank you to Madison and Gurkha for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor. I work for Bits of Freedom. Bits of Freedom is an independent non-profit. We focus on privacy and freedom of speech on the internet, internet freedom, so to say. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the trends that I see, which is this idea, or this sort of increasing prevalence of the false positive. And I'll give you sort of 3 reasons for it, and I hope there's going to be plenty of opportunity for questions afterwards. So first of all, what is a false positive? Let me just do something before I feel irritated for the rest of the... There we go. So a false positive is basically, it's commonly called a false alarm. So it is when you indicate that something is the case, when you really think about it, or when what is really the case is that it's not the case. And I think there's 3 reasons why they are becoming more prevalent. The first, and that has really not much to do with computing and IT and technology, but the first is that we live, and we're starting to live more and more in a culture of fear. And there's many reasons for it. There's many books written about it. You have Ulrich Beck and the Risk Society. You have Zygmunt Bauman discussing this. But what we see is that rather than having sort of a base level of trust in each other, which is a very necessary thing to live as humans and to socialize, we are actually scared of each other more and more often. There's going to be the occasional Dutch slide I'll translate. So this is research by our Dutch statistical agency, where just from a week ago or so, where they say that 4 in 10 Dutch people think that the chance of there being a terrorist attack is big. And actually, when you look at it, you see that around 3 out of every 10, or about 25% of people, think that there's a chance that they are going to be a victim of an attack as well. I have quite a few friends that are nervous nowadays when they sit on a train that goes past Schiphol. I know people who cross the street when they see somebody who looks like he's from Arabian descent. So this is something that is slowly seeping into a society. And I think it leads actually to bad judgments and marginalized people getting hurt. So a few examples. So this is a very famous example. It's Ahmed Mohammed in the US, 14-year-old boy, a nerd like most of us here. He built his own clock, brings it to school, he's proud. The teacher thinks it's a bomb. The police come, put him in handcuffs, take him away. And then, of course, he's rehabilitated, gets to meet Obama, etc. But in the end, this is a teacher that doesn't believe their own student that something is a clock, rather thinks it's a bomb. There's more examples. There's endless. This is one of my favorites. Explosives turn out to be shawarma herbs. This is the Swedish beard club. They were posing for a picture somewhere in, I believe, in Stockholm. They have a black flag. The police showed up instantly because people with beards and a black flag can't be a good thing. This is I find this a very sad story. This man has Parkinson's disease. He had just gone to the hospital and he received a sort of a new trial sort of machine. It's a little thing that they put around a shoe. And what it does, it shows a little laser for where he needs to put his next foot. So then he can step, and then there's another laser, and he can step. And basically, he was sitting in the bus in Utrecht Central Station. The bus didn't leave, and the bus driver refused to get in. Police was called. He was pulled off the bus. And there's actually sort of a TV interview about how traumatizing it was for him to sort of be accused in this way. And this, you can read this in the newspaper many, many times. So it is, you have the famous story of the guy doing math, where they think it was Arabic. had to get off the plane before they would leave. These people came from a honeymoon in Paris. They were a bit warm. They called their mom to say that they were coming home, and they had to be taken off the plane. So this really happens quite a lot. And occasionally it really gets quite ludicrous. This is one of my favorites of a false alarm. This is a guy who's bought one of those drop cams in his house. It's basically a cam that you can put in your house, and as soon as there's movement, it starts filming and it immediately uploads it to some cloud server where you can then see what happens in your house. And basically this guy woke up and he received an email with a video of himself walking naked through his own house. And apparently the camera thought that he was a burglar. And this is the moment he realized that there was suddenly now images of his naked body on a cloud server somewhere that he wasn't sure where. And this is my absolute favorite example. This is the police officer that was chasing himself after being mistaken for a burglar. So basically there was somebody behind the police of these CCTV cameras who was instructing a police officer to go behind a burglar going, "You're nearly there, you must see him, he's very close." And basically the guy was chasing himself. A second trend is making this thing, in a sense, worse. And this is the fact that we want computers to do our work. And we have this sort of, I would argue, sort of nearly irrational, or maybe it's not irrational. Our brains are not very good at assessing the truth of a computer. So I think that we are quite often accept what the computer says as true because it's a computer that says it, and it must be very precise and exact, etc. And this leads to interesting problems. So for example, we have, this is a US-based example, where they were migrating from court software. They didn't really get the dates correct on certain things. So many people who had already long paid off their dues were suddenly now reset, had to redo it, were arrested, etc. So this basically arrests from a wrong migration to a new court tool. This is an incredibly sad story about a guy who was lifted from his house and was being accused of having child pornography. He was arrested, put in jail. He knew for sure that he was innocent, and it took about 2 years to prove it. And when they really dug into it and found out what had happened, is that somewhere the police had actually added a single digit to an IP address, turning the IP address of the perpetrator into his IP address. And that took an incredible amount of time before that was solved. And this was also quite interesting because an IP address is obviously not the same thing as a person, but they went into the house. This guy is actually a black guy. They immediately arrested him, left his wife, everybody else who was in the house alone. He must have been the perpetrator. Another famous example, this 6-year-old boy is now for a few years on a no-fly list just because his name is the same as somebody else that apparently needs to be on the no-fly list. There's no way to sort of get him off. Every time he travels, he needs to be picked out, the extra questioning, etc. This is his father saying, you know, when does this stop? This is an example from this week or last week. The story is actually a year old, but for some reason in the Netherlands it arrived last week. This is the famous World Check database. It is a private database of terrorists or sort of alleged terrorists, and also people who have political connections. I think 49 out of the top 50 banks use this list to decide whether they can give somebody a bank account or a loan, etc. And Dutch reporters looked into the list, found that Princess Amalia was on the list, Rutte was on the list. Rutte's father, who apparently has died in 1988, was still on the list. So the fact is we have a database of 2.2 million records, sensitive records. First of all, Thomson wasn't able to keep the database safe, so the whole database was leaked. And then we got the opportunity to look at the database, and we found out that the database was actually full of data that's incorrect, wrong, outdated, alleged, etc. So there's a lot of victims in that sense for that. I'm convinced that this will actually get worse, unfortunately. And that is because we are continually looking for extremely rare things. And this could be seen as a contentious statement, but a terrorist attack, thank God, even in the current times, are incredibly rare events. They don't happen often. The problem is when they happen, we all know about it. But the chances of you or any of us dying in a terrorist attack here in the Netherlands is thousands of times smaller than the chances of us dying in traffic. So we're looking for incredibly rare things that don't occur very often, using imperfect technology. All technology is imperfect, always, with a systemic bias quite often in the technologies, and we're doing that more and more. So just a little example. I hope I've done my math correct, but this is the audience that will correct me when I haven't. So imagine that 1 in every 2 million travelers is actually in a database with pictures of potential terrorists, of their face. And imagine that you have facial recognition software at the border that has an error rate of 15% on potential terrorists. So imagine if you are on the list as a potential terrorist and you arrive at the airport, there's an 85% chance that the thing will correctly identify you as somebody in that list, and 15% chance that it will say, no, this person is not on the list. This is quite a realistic sort of assessment of the error rate. And imagine it has a 0.2% error rate on non-potential terrorists. So that is, you arrive there, you're actually not on the list, but there's a very small chance, a 1 in 500 chance, that the thing will flag you as a potential terrorist, even though you're not on the list. So what is then the chance that a recognized person is actually in the terrorist database? So imagine somebody walks through, the database says, yes, this person is on the list. What is the chance? Anybody dare to venture a guess? There's somebody there? One in something thousand. Somebody say less. Yeah. In my calculation, it is indeed 0.02% or 1 in 5,000. So that means that for every person that you've sort of flagged correctly, you will, on average, flag around 5,000 people wrongly and accuse them of a very serious thing in a sense. And I think we don't realize when we use this type of technology that that is the case. I'm not necessarily arguing that you shouldn't use that type of technology, but I am arguing that the assumption should be, when somebody is flagged, that it is a false positive in this sense, yes, because the chances are just that much higher. And you should sort of treat people not as a suspect immediately, but you need some more stuff for that. You can see this actually already happening. So there is currently about half of the adults in the United States are already in an FBI database of faces. Apparently, some research journalists found out that the FBI is using things like driver's license databases, etc., to fill this database. And this algorithm is wrong nearly 15% of the time, and it is way more likely to misidentify black people when they've done the research. In the Netherlands, we have a government that would like to give our secret services the ability to do mass surveillance, to use dragnet surveillance, and basically try and look at large amounts of data to then find to find events that don't happen very often. So basically, the government wants to have its own sort of false positive machine. And you can see there's the Scientific Council that sort of gives advice to our government. They've just released, or just last year, they've released a report called Big Data in a Free and Safe Society. And basically, they looked at this idea of what needs to happen before we can use big data in a safe way to make our society better. And the report was actually quite critical. So a few things it found was, one, is that there's a lot of talk about big data, but there's actually very, very few examples of it being used in a sensible way and it actually creating any sort of solution for law enforcement. It also says the following. It says, I'll do a very loose translation, data mining, the way that you do analysis with big data, is not very appropriate for all sorts of crime fighting, because, especially not for terrorist attacks, it's probably ineffective. That is because pattern recognition works best for things that have a very regular pattern, obviously, and because every terrorist attack is sort of unique, it is barely, or it's really not possible to create a good profile. And so in a combination with the small amount of attacks, you get error rates that are just too high. The third reason why we will see more and more false positives is because surveillance capitalism is becoming the sort of dominant strategy on the web to make money. And this is a paper by Shoshana Zuboff, an American researcher. She wrote this about 2 years ago. It's titled Big Other, Surveillance Capitalism and the Prospects of an Information Civilization. And she basically uses Google as the example. And I think she puts sort of the finger on the sore spots, as we say in Dutch, around what is the problem of the sort of business model that is behind Google. So I'm going to give you a very short course. It's titled How to Become a Surveillance Capitalist in 4 Steps. And basically, the first step is you gather as much data as possible. So that is what Google does. Basically, many of your phones are just Google sensors trying to get as much data about the world as possible. Every search request that you do, every email that you get in, every Google Maps thing that you do, etc., it's all data. Every voice command, every voice call, everything is stored, and you gather as much as you can. Then, of course, you hire a bunch of data scientists, and with machine learning algorithms, you try and find patterns in behavior. And you make predictions on the basis of this pattern about future behavior. So that's the third step. And then what you do is you sell those or trade those predictive behaviors on a prediction market. And according to Zuboff, Google is sort of the first one and sort of the major one to do this. Their prediction market currently is advertising. So it is around what are the things that I would be interested in seeing. But in general, these prediction markets could be anything. Yeah? So as long as you have enough data and you do this sort of checking, then you can predict what people are going to do, where they're going to go, what they're going to buy, whether they're going to be a criminal or not. It really doesn't matter. We can predict everything. And I think what is the problem with that is that whereas for government, you can say, well, a false positive is actually hurting the legitimacy of the government. Yeah? So basically, every person who is wrongfully arrested is hurting the government, and the government has a true interest in not accusing people falsely. and I think they really have an intention of not doing that. Whereas for a business, a false positive is just in a sense collateral damage. Yeah, it is really just a mistake, as long as 95% of the predictions are okay, or as long as on average there's more good predictions than bad predictions, then it's probably worthwhile doing it, no matter what the consequences are for other people. Of course, here again, it is the less privileged quite often who receive the damage. So these are just two quick examples, also Google-based. So this is research, it's already a little bit older. Basically what happens if you put inside Google, I'm sure they probably tried to fix it by now, but if you put in a name that is traditionally seen as a Afro-American name, in this case the researcher's name, she was called Latanya Sweeney. When she typed in Latanya Sweeney in Google, it would show basically ads that would ads to a database where you could see how often she was arrested, ads for a bail officer around getting her out, etc. So basically, the Google algorithm was assuming this is an Afro-American name. I'm going to provide services that have to do with criminality. There's sort of many things that you can say about that. You could say, yeah, well, the world is just a reflection of the world in a sense. But of course, even if that is the case, then, which I don't think it is, but then you could argue that still this is not the correct thing to show when a Harvard professor searches for her own name. Another quite famous example, Google is providing the ability to auto-tag your pictures. So you upload all your pictures and they have sort of an uncanny ability to say, oh, this was a party, this was your graduation, this is a holiday, probably it was in Paris, and it puts all the pictures in Paris together. You can even search on names, so you can put in the name of a friend, it will show you all your friends. You can put in the name of your son, it will show you all your sons. And this is a guy that turned this on, and he basically said, Google Photos, you're all fucked up, my friend is not a gorilla. And because Google created a category that was listed as gorillas. So what can we do to solve this problem of this increased false positives? So I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to strengthen redress. And with that, I mean that it can't be the case that if you are wrongfully arrested because somebody mistyped an IP address, that it takes you 2 years to prove your innocence. That must be done quicker. And there's many people who are, for some reason, listed in a database wrongly. I mean, in the Netherlands, we have these examples nowadays of people who, where the Dutch authorities are convinced that you still have a car, but the car actually doesn't exist anymore, but the database says it exists, and the database also says that you haven't paid any insurance on it, so you automatically get a fine. Then, of course, because it's the Netherlands, you can only protest against the fine after paying the fine, but quite often you haven't paid for the car and for the insurance because you can't afford it. So you also can't afford the fine, and then because you can't pay the fine and you also can't protest against the fine becomes higher, which means it's even become harder to protest against the fine. So this sort of stuff, you can really in the Netherlands be on the wrong side of a database, so to say, and arrive in some sort of Kafkaesque hellhole where you can't get out. So we need to make sure that we find ways of redressing. Correcting a false positive needs to be as easy as making the mistake. The second thing is we need to sort of monitor the problem. I don't think we pay enough attention in a structural way in researching how often does this happen. So every news story, you have to imagine in your head, this is a story that made the news. That means there's probably hundreds of stories like this who've never managed to make the news. Our British sisters, Privacy International, have started a project called Data Exploitation. Basically, they're looking for examples, etc., of devices and infrastructure that is actually exploiting people through data. They'd like examples. And for me, if you find any false positives, I'm sort of collect them myself, not in a structural way, I'm not a researcher, but please share them with me if you have examples. Then you need to be very conscious of the training sets you use for your machine learning algorithms. So the fact that a black woman was tagged as a gorilla means, it can mean that it's harder for a computer to differentiate between a white person as a human being and a black person. But what it also means is that probably your data set didn't include enough black people. And it also probably means that your people who were testing your product also weren't diverse enough. Yeah? It should have been that during the testing phase, you find out, hey, wait, our algorithm is not really good at this specific problem, so let's create more training data so that they can become more precise in this thing. So you need to be conscious of the training set, and you need to explicitly test them for bias. There are researchers that have created testing methodologies where you can find out, is this a fair algorithm or isn't it? Then I think we need to enforce transparency around error rates. So if we use machines to make decisions, we need to know how often the machine is wrong, and we need to be transparent about that, and we need to train people to sort of read the machine decision to know how sure is this machine actually, with what sort of level of confidence can it make that decision. And then the important thing is, I think we need to, in some way, keep a human being in the loop. So I'm well aware that that there's certain subset of problems where computers can probably be more fair and also more consistent and more complete in making, for example, a diagnosis. There's in certain medical cases, it is pretty clear that if you keep a human in the loop, if you get a computer in the loop, you can really augment the human-based decision-making. But I also do believe that you need to keep a human in the loop. And I'm sure there's other options. So if you're willing to help me create solutions, then that would be very welcome. The final thing I always need to say, everybody needs to resist the reduction. Yeah? You are not your data. You are a human being. And you need to be aware that other people are also not their data. They're also human beings. And so we need to resist the reduction and please keep looking at people as individuals. That was my talk. I hope there's questions. Thank you very much. Yeah. Bits of Freedom is an independent non-profit. We can't survive without donors. So if you work for a company and you have a hard time finding programmers or developers, developers often love to work for a company that supports Bits of Freedom. It really helps to think about it. You can also become an individual supporter. So thank you.
Okay, well, based on your presentation, I would say recommended, indeed.
Thank you.
Well done. Well, it's clear that technology brings a lot of good things, but there are also side effects that can go quite far and can harm quite a lot of individuals.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you explained very well with all the false positives that you have shown, and of course there are many, many more. And like what you say, the trend is to automate many things even more, and that might have even worse side effects, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think if we don't pay attention to it, and if we don't keep track of it well, and if we put too much trust in machine-based decisions. For some reason, we think a machine is neutral, so that's one thing that's quite often a problem. We have this idea that because it's a computer, and because we've fed it with data, it will sort of create consistent decisions. And that's actually just not true and not the case anymore.
Yeah, and I can imagine that for the average person, that it works quite well, but those that are, well, in a bit different situation, it might work completely otherwise.
Yeah, what is interesting, for example, is that with these machine learning algorithms, quite often the machine learning just takes the bias that is already existing in society and teaches itself that. So for example, I'll give two examples. So one is if you use the current. So if you look at who is at the top of companies, and you use that as a model for trying to predict who's going to be at the top of companies, so that you can give those people extra attention, fast-track them, put them in a leadership role, etc. Then, of course, you're going to find that the chances of a male are much higher to reach the top of the company than female. Whereas that is not necessarily a representation of true quality, but it's actually a representation of the current status quo, which has structural reasons for why that is the case that don't necessarily have to do with true leadership potential. Another example that I find quite interesting is Google Translate. Basically has also a gender bias. And it gets that from our language and the way we use the language. So they found this out, or they could see this very clearly by using Turkish. So Turkish is apparently, I'm not sure, but as I've been told, is a non-gendered language. So when you say in Turkish you would say he or she is a nurse. That he, she is a not gendered thing. And in Dutch and also in English, you have to say he is a nurse or she is a nurse. And so when you translate from Turkish, he or she is a nurse, into English, Google Translate will turn that into she is a nurse. And when you put he or she is a doctor into Turkish, it will say he is a doctor in English. And we can't blame Google for that. But you have to realize that sort of the biases that are currently existing in society, they're not gone as soon as you use a machine learning algorithm, because it's not. They need to use the real world as training data. That's, I think, a problem.
Thank you. Well, it's time for questions.
And that's a pity. I wanted to throw it far.
Right.
But here we go.
Luc, sorry.
Back to you. You called to resist in your last slide. But I'm not a police officer. I'm not often in a position to resist classifying people or in a position to classify someone. How does a common person resist?
I used to work at Shell, one of the largest companies in the world at that point in time, becoming smaller quite fast. And for example, at Shell, I was often reduced to my competencies that were in some HR system where some people had decided what competences were important for me to have as a, I don't know what they call me, HR generalist or something like that. I was an HR generalist with the HR competency profile working in the IT function, and I had to fill in these lists of what I was. And basically, Shell made their sort of hiring decisions and promotion decisions on the basis of that data, this reduction of me as a human being with particular talents in a Shell context. And none of these talents that I had, and none of the lack of talents also, I should say, were reflected in that database. So there's many places where you are reduced to data, and there's also, think, many places where you reduce others in data, especially if you work in IT. And for me, it's also, you could see it as a challenge. Try and see the people who are behind the data and spend time. This is also my issue that I have with blockchain-based smart contracts, for example, because you need exceptions in the world. Computers are not very good at exceptions. Human beings are, and that's why the society works. But if you take out all exceptions out of the world, it's not a happy place, I can assure you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it's an interesting statement that you made, because earlier today we heard already from Bill that it's not all about the data, it's about the information that you extract from the data.
Yeah.
That was his statement. I think your statement is like the data itself is not sufficient because it simplifies the reality.
Yeah, it's a model of the reality, and models are not reality.
Which makes sense, of course. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Ooh, in the back.
Would
you like to throw?
Can I kick it?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
So before I worked at Shell, I was a physical education teacher at a high school.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay. English, yeah. Okay.
You have to speak inside of it.
Okay.
As like an idiot, basically.
Can you hear me? Okay.
A bit higher, please. Yeah, that's better.
So in a lot of contexts, you see that. Well, it's not maybe actually a good thing that you can always point the blame at somebody in other problems. But would you say that in this case, especially in the Kafkaesque situations, it may be so that because a computer makes all the decisions, or a computer system makes all the decisions, you can't actually appoint the responsibility of a failure to a specific person. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't it be a solution to make it so that if something goes wrong, if some group of people get discriminated against, if somebody is wrongfully accused of being a pedophile, that you should be able to point to a specific person and let him or her get the responsibility for the failure of the system? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it solve the problem?
So it's interesting that it's another trend to sort of design processes. So I think that a lot of things in Google are designed in such a way that nobody inside Google ever has responsibility for something that happens. I know it's a pretty conscious design decision in how the governance around drone strikes works. So basically, everybody who has a part in doing a drone strike somewhere in Pakistan can't feel that they are the one that sort of made the decision. And I do think that is problematic because it makes sort of immoral behavior harder. It creates more distance between the you're just coding an algorithm somewhere in Silicon Valley that makes hiring decisions somewhere else in the world. The distances are so great. There's there's a famous example that I use sometimes. This is in the US. They've done, of course, during the Cold War, a lot of thinking about how do you make sure that a president isn't too flippant in pressing sort of that nuclear power button? Yeah. So how can we make sure that something that feels, because you're just pressing a button, is very very clean, easy act, and then somewhere at the other end of the world, a whole Japanese city gets blown away. So basically, one guy came up with a solution to sort of decrease that distance between what it is that you're doing and the effect by saying basically we should put the nuclear codes very close to the heart of a real person that basically walks next to the president. And if the president wants to use the nuclear codes, he first needs to kill that person to get the codes out. And then he could use them. And this is actually a researcher proposed this, and he actually offered himself to be the person carrying the codes. But I think it's sort of a good idea that you need to sort of decrease the distance between what it is that you're doing and the effect that you're having.
So you're in favor of the suicide terrorists, or?
No. No, I'm not.
Okay.
But I don't know. I also don't want to oversimplify things, because there is not a single guilty person for the fact that we're going to have a dragnet surveillance law in the Netherlands. Yeah, we can, of course, the minister is responsible, but there's so many people involved in many different ways, a lot of them with the best intentions, a lot of them with a lot of expertise, but the outcome still in the end is something that I really dislike. But very often for many processes you can't find a single guilty person. So finding that is also wouldn't be the solution, I think.
Okay, next question.
Well, when finding a person who's responsible, isn't it the point to, instead of making the program responsible for itself, the person who ordered the program is still responsible for the process?
Yeah, so yes, I think you could say that. But also, what serious program gets built by a single person?
It doesn't get built by a single person, but you made an example of the one programmer in Silicon Valley making the program to hire people.
Yeah.
What selection?
Yeah.
Someone ordered that program because he wanted the program to hire people.
Yeah.
So that person should evaluate the program and see whether it fits what he wants with the program or not.
Yeah.
And that person or department, whoever wanted it, then is responsible for the hiring process and uses the program to help.
Yeah, but
You can automate it, but you're still responsible for the thing. You
yeah,
can't
you're still
automate
responsible, but
something
very often you don't realize sort of the hurt. So another Shell example. Shell used to get thousands of applicants every week, I believe. And of course, they can't evaluate all these CVs manually, so they actually use software to do it. Yeah? Then they were also very sneaky, because they didn't want to give people the feeling that it was software doing it. So basically, you upload your CV, Shell decides within milliseconds whether you're eligible or not, but then waits for 2 days to tell you that you're not. Yeah? So pretend like somebody actually looked at it. The person who is sort of instituting that software, I don't know if you've ever worked in a big company, but it's not one person, it's a whole team. It's actually not Shell people who did that. It's Accenture people who were hired in as consultants to do this. They had to deal with this software. You never see the person who sort of get rejected. You can't see why they were really rejected. All you see is sort of the 100 candidates that are let through. You don't know whether those are the best 100, but you just need to assume that. So it's just a messy sort of problem. And I think in general the problem is quite messy. So for me, it needs to be that we need to all be much more aware that if a computer makes a decision, that then we can still argue with it. And we should argue with it. And also we should be transparent about it. So to me, I've always said inside Shell, we need to tell people that we're doing it with a machine. Because then at least they know that if they fail, that it's not because somebody looked at it and thought it was shit, it was just a computer who thought that. But then they were afraid that the algorithms would be gamed. It's probably a valid fear, but I think you don't think the algorithms are gamed now. How do you know? So it's a difficult problem. But in the end, it is up to all of us, I think, to be aware of the fact that technology has certain effects. It makes certain things easier, it makes certain things harder, and we need to really look at it to see what the effects are rather than make assumptions.
But then in the case of this hiring process, the board or person responsible for the hiring process probably didn't pay enough attention to just order a program which can't be reevaluated.
Yeah, no, but yeah. I don't know if you've ever been in a procurement process for software in a multinational, but it's not necessary that you get the best program out of it.
Okay, next question.
Question.
Christian.
Okay, so I'm not a lawyer, so I'm missing some nuances here, but according to the Data Protection Directive, at least, you have the right to not be subject to automatic decision-making. As again, I'm not a lawyer, but...
No, yeah.
So how would one exercise this right?
Yeah, that's very hard. I think I'm also not a lawyer, but I think it's slightly more complicated than this. the thing is very often in this current data protection sort of legislation, if you give permission, then basically anything goes. And so that is one of the biggest loopholes, is that quite often you just give permission, you use the service, so then
So that's
yeah,
consent by default. Which
yeah,
is
you've given consent in a sense, and then that means that you can be analyzed and done stuff with. The problem with it, in general, with this whole General Data Protection Directive, I think you've had talks about this today as well in the morning. I wasn't here, unfortunately. Is that it sort of attacks the problem in a different way. It looks at individuals and their personal data, and it doesn't really look at the structural, for example, power imbalances that are created with something like surveillance capitalism. So it doesn't look at the information asymmetries, it doesn't look at sort of the antitrust issues. So it's a very narrow focus. You have the right to have your data removed, but for example, there's a lot of leeway in the GDPR for pseudonymizeren, anonymizing data and pseudonymizing data. I hope I got that one this time. There's a lot of leeway for that. And as soon as that has happened, it's not your data anymore, but you're still actually adding the data into it. And you also can be, stuff can also be decided against you. So I always use this example, yeah? So if insurance companies are starting to use data to see whether certain car owners have more accidents than other car owners. And of course, they're giving you a discount if you share your data. And I always say, even if I decide not to take the discount, I still suffer from the results of other people, because if they find out that people who drive a red car have a higher chance of having an accident, and I have a red car, then still I will be penalized for it in a sense. So here again, it's not being looked as an individual, but as a data point, red car driver. So yeah, so you I think we can't solve this problem using a data protection angle only. We need to find other mechanisms.
So maybe we should have some sort of data protection laws for profiles, not for individuals, but people who fall in a certain profile.
Yeah, and profiling is sort of lobbied out of that law. So there's way too much leeway to do profiling to solve this problem,
Back to the drawing
unfortunately.
board.
Yeah.